Hello, I'm Dr. 𝗖𝗢𝗡𝗏, and I'm delighted to have today for this interview Naftuli Moster of YAFFED, a very interesting organization. And a friend of mine, Todd Kadish, introduced me to Naftali, and I looked at your organization's website and I was like, I want to learn more. So, would you mind sharing with us a little bit of your journey, how you were raised, and what you do?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, Stephen. So yeah, I grew up in a neighborhood in Brooklyn called Borough Park. It's an almost entirely Hasidic neighborhood.
Hmm.
I grew up in a Hasidic community. My family belonged to what's called the Belz Hasidic sect, Belz, as opposed to the bells ding ding ding.
Right.
Um, and I am the middle child of 17 kids.
17.
Yeah, from a
Wow.
single father and mother. Um, so I grew up in that community, went to Hasidic yeshivas my entire life, basically from when I was 2.5 years old till I was 19, 20. And then I had this bizarre idea of becoming a psychologist. I say bizarre because in my community where I grew up, at the time, I didn't know of a single psychologist in Brooklyn. I knew of this one psycholog, we called him, because that's the Yiddish or Hebrew way of saying it, in Israel, who was in the Belz Hasidic sect. But I say bizarre because we didn't have many. And in fact, um, mental illness was seriously stigmatized. And in fact, that's why I wanted to go into it. I saw that it existed was a lot of mental illness in my community, even in my family, that I could see went undiagnosed and untreated. And I felt that I would be good at it. So I wanted to pursue a degree to the extent that I knew what a degree was. Anyway, I walked into a local school. It's a branch of Touro College. This one catered specifically to Orthodox Jews. How do I know? It had separate sides, separate wings for men and women. They were sensitive to the needs of Orthodox Jews. But I say Orthodox to be specific, not necessarily ultra-Orthodox, and certainly not necessarily Hasidic Jews.
Okay.
It's important for your viewers to understand that there's a key difference here. The Hasidic community is kind of like all the way to the right of all of that. Um, so here I was, someone who grew up in a Hasidic Yiddish speaking home and community. I had gotten almost no education growing up whatsoever, and I'm trying to pursue a degree. I don't know anything about college. I don't know what the um, application process, the enrollment process, or what a major, a minor, a credit, a semester, a GPA, all of that was brand new. Anyway, I walk in there and I proclaim I want to become a psychologist, and they're like, "Okay, do you have a high school diploma?" And I'm like, "What is that?" I didn't go to high school. I went to yeshiva. So okay, so they're like, go to your yeshiva, maybe you have a high school diploma somewhere. I called them, they sent me some paper that I completed high school, but it was useless. It wasn't backed up by a transcript, and it certainly wasn't a regent's approved diploma. So basically, there was another way to get me into college through taking an exam, an entrance exam. It consisted of just doing writing an essay and doing an easy math exam or practically a quiz. Well, I couldn't do either. I This was my first time hearing the word essay, let alone actually constructing one, and I couldn't do basic math, even somewhat arithmetic.
And how much English did you know at this point? Just out of
You know,
curiosity.
it's a good question because a lot of people, take this very like unnuanced approach to this. They're like, "Oh, Hasidim don't they can't speak English." Well, they do grow up in Brooklyn and in other parts of New York, so you speak English, but it's a very non-fluent English. So it was a very broken English. Like I said, I could speak the basics. I could say I want to go to college, but clearly anything beyond that, like, okay, what do you want to major in? What is major? What do you want to minor in? don't know. Like I've never heard those terms. I mean, I could have heard those words in different, like, oh, it's a major celebration, right? But I wouldn't know what a major is in the college context,
Right.
or like I said, what an essay is. In fact, one of the prompts to my essay, remember, this is an Orthodox college, so one of the prompts was something that involved the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt. Well, I've never heard the word exodus. Keep in mind, I studied 𝗖𝗎𝗡𝗦𝗧, that's the Hebrew
Right.
word for the exodus, my entire life. Plenty. That I knew, but I had never heard the word exodus. So that's like one example of like, it's not transferable, right? So that's what I'm saying. I could string together sentences. It was clearly a broken English. But no, I wasn't ready for college. And in fact, when I did get in, I had to take 8 credits worth of remedial English that did not count towards my degree. A big waste of time. I mean, it was very useful because I actually learned a lot. Like it was the first time in my life that I learned contractions, like when you put together 2 words like are and aren't, is and isn't. So I came home after that class and I wanted to show off and use my English skills. Now, the Hasidic girls get a better education, so my sisters got a much better education. They, in fact, even communicated in English amongst themselves, which was prohibited, but certainly not something that boys did. Anyway, I come home and I wanted to show off my English skills, and I'm like, something like, I amn't going to whatever. And they burst out laughing, and it was a friendly kind, but yeah, that's my point, that we didn't know the basic rules of grammar and how to communicate. But anyway, I did manage to get into college. It was an arduous process, and just getting through the basics and, sitting through a class where the professor is trying to build upon your prior knowledge. But for me, I was both building my new knowledge as well as my old knowledge, like building and a foundation at the same time. It was a tremendous struggle.
Can I interrupt and just ask you, what did your family think of this, and what did your community think of you going to an Orthodox college to become a mental health professional?
Well, I had to keep it a secret from most of the people you just mentioned.
Okay.
Because I was an unmarried man, and going to college is, in general, is not an acceptable thing. But certainly, if you're going to go do it before you get married, how are they going to find you a nice arranged marriage, a match? So that was like a big no. You don't just do it. Most people don't do it, but certainly don't publicize it. But my family knew. And my parents tried to dissuade me again and again and again from doing it because, in fact, I still had an older brother and an older sister who were waiting to have their matches made. And my parents were concerned, and they were also concerned that it would negatively reflect on them, right?
In
And
your
potentially,
community, it's your parents that arrange with other parents to match
well,
the children?
the
Or
way it
I don't
works
want to get
is,
too far afield, but for my
yeah,
listeners.
no, the way it works is either the parents contact the matchmaker or matchmaker contacts your parents. And then, yeah, so they contact both sets of parents, and then they arrange a meeting with the parents. They arrange for, let's say, the father of the girl to go take a glance at the boy, snooping on him as he sits in yeshiva or wherever he is, and vice versa. The mother of the boy will go, look at the girl somehow. Sometimes they'll arrange where the girl will walk through like a Judaica bookstore, and the mother will look. It's like, so that part, it could be orchestrated. It's very interesting. Um, you know,
All right,
anyway,
back to
so there
school.
was a lot of pressure for me to drop out.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, this is not a joke. I never, as a kid, I didn't understand the expression looking over your shoulder. But as a 20-year-old guy, I actually had to look over my shoulder, like not even an expression, like for real, look over my shoulder as I was walking into college. So what I would do is, I was afraid someone would see me go in, right? And then all these negative consequences. So I would sometimes not only look over my shoulder, but sometimes I would walk past the door of the school, turn around and see if I was followed, or if there's anyone who might know me from the same community, see me go in, and then I would slip through the door. It's a real fear. So yeah, it was not a positive. It was not viewed as a positive thing. I managed to get in. It was a tremendous struggle because reading English was just so difficult for me. And again, as a kid, I was a top boy in Judaic studies. Reading Torah, Talmud, and all of that stuff was easy to me. Reading Yiddish books, I loved it. I gobbled it up. And then I couldn't translate it into the English language. And to this day, I struggle with that. I have this book, Educated, which,
Tara Westover was raised in a Mormon survivalist cult group.
Yeah.
Her family didn't want her to get educated either, and she wound up going to Cambridge University, if I remember, becoming a scholar.
Yeah, and I got this as a birthday present, and it's something that I know more or less the story, and I want to read it, and it's the kind of thing that I should read, even just to be able to do my work and do outreach, to her and to others. I can't get through a book like that to this day. I still struggle immensely. And that was the struggle that I had in college, even, on steroids, if you will, because, I would have to reread the chapter over and over just to process it. At the time, I was still thinking in Yiddish, translating it into English, and then processing it, right? So it was a big struggle, and much of my schooling, I was like going around aimlessly, still not fully comprehending the major minor thing. But I was doing well because I really worked hard, evenings, weekends, to study and everything. But at some point, and by that point I had transferred to a city college, I realized what had been done to me. I guess I have to take your viewers back now. Why all the struggle, right? I jumped right into it, but why am I struggling? I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and New York State has decent education laws. Why am I struggling, right? And I went to a private school, right? What exactly happened? So yeah, in Hasidic yeshivas, they don't emphasize secular studies. So in elementary and middle school, I got about 90 minutes of secular education a day, if you can call it that. It happened more like an after-school program. So from 9 a.m., let's say, or earlier, till 3:30 p.m. was Judaic studies, taught in Yiddish. Then at 3:30 p.m., we started secular education for either an hour or 90 minutes, depending on the grade. And it was, they taught us basic English and arithmetic. At least they tried, because we kids didn't value it. We said, foy, it's tuma, which is the Hebrew word for profane, right? So we had a lot of disdain for it. And the administration didn't care enough for it either to discipline us the same way as they did during Jewish studies. So if during Jewish studies you pulled your Rebbe or your teacher's beard, you would be out for the next week. But that was not an uncommon occurrence during secular studies, and no one batted an eye.
Me literally pulling the beard of
This was one particular story that I remember vividly. We would torture our teachers, secular studies teachers, and there was barely any consequences. The biggest consequence was that you would get kicked out of the classroom, and then you would be rewarded to be able to roam the hallways and potentially buy coffee for some teacher or the principal, or make copies, which every boy just wanted to do. So anyway, this is elementary and middle school, a little, 90 minutes, basic English and arithmetic, and that's it. 4 days a week, because guess what? Friday, we would finish early for Shabbos. So secular studies goes out the window. And this was all the time. If you had a bar mitzvah, it happens in the evening. You have a wedding, you leave right before secular education. You have Sheva brachas. These are the celebrations after a wedding. You leave right before secular studies. It was always the first thing to go, which just tells you what kind of, regard they had for the secular education. If you had to schedule a dentist appointment, during secular education, it's every minor Jewish holiday. Even if you do have Jewish studies, secular education goes out the window. Like Hanukkah, you leave right before secular education. This week, I think tomorrow or Friday. Well, if it's Friday, it's different. But if it's like on a regular weekday, there's Lag BaOmer. They light a bonfire and whatever. You have a full school day, except you leave before secular education. So it's basically a joke. But anyway, let me move on. In high school, once we got to high school, our school day got longer. We would attend yeshiva from as early as 6:30 a.m., 6:45 a.m., stay in yeshiva till 8:30 or 9 p.m. We're talking about a good 14 hours of yeshiva. Now, how much of that time do you think was spent on secular education? The answer is zero. Zero. No English, no math, no science, no social studies, literally nothing. Okay? All day we study Judaic studies. Again, this is the Torah, which is like the Old Testament, Talmud, some interpretation of the Torah, Halacha, which is Jewish law, all of it taught in Yiddish, although the text is in ancient Hebrew or even Aramaic, but translated into Yiddish, which is the language we spoke. I like to quip, on average, a Hasidic adolescent boy utters 2 words of English a day, bus and lunch. That's it, you know? And they're all day surrounded by people who look like them or their parents, right? So it's all boys. The teachers are all, ultra-Orthodox Hasidic, rabbis, if you will. And that's what it's like until they get engaged at the age of 17 or 18 or 19.
So can I just interrupt for a second to give a historical frame, and please correct me if I'm in error, but the Belz community came to the U.S. post-Holocaust, that there was a resettlement to keep the traditions the way they were back in Europe, correct?
Yes, and this is not just the case for the Belz Hasidic sect. This is the case for, pretty
All
much the Hasidic movement, if you will. I don't know to what extent, what we see now in Borough Park and Williamsburg and other parts of New York State, if that actually reflects what existed, back in Ukraine or Poland. I mean, Stephen, this is another issue. We never learned geography. Right. We never learned our own history. Do you know that? We didn't learn the history of the Holocaust. Wow. This is something that a lot of people don't understand.
That surprises me.
I know. And this is the thing that a lot of people are like, whatever. Look at the failing public schools. This is the refrain we get all the time. Look at the failing public schools. Find me one public school that doesn't teach English, that doesn't teach math, that doesn't teach science and social studies, but even our own history, right? Obviously, we were surrounded, not so much now, but we were surrounded by some Holocaust survivors. I had Holocaust survivors' grandparents. But how much do you think they spoke about the Holocaust? None. They didn't want to revisit it, right? So we knew it existed. We knew 6 million Jews were killed, but that was the extent of it. There was no...
Yeah, no, thank you. This is new for me. But Yiddish is a German dialect. Am I not understanding? Or could you give us a few sentences in Yiddish for those who have no experience or exposure?
I don't know how it would help. Man Numen is Naftuli Moster, if it helps. I don't know enough.
Your name, you just said your name.
My name is Naftuli. I don't know enough about our own history to tell you where it originated from, because my understanding is most Jews who were unfortunately exterminated did not live in Germany. Right. There were other parts that either at the time or now were part of Poland and Russia and things like that. And that's where they spoke Yiddish or some version of it. So I just honestly don't know enough of it. And this is an important point that a lot of people don't realize, that to the degree to which our education is so limited to essentially the holy text, Judaic studies.
My limited knowledge as a more renewal Jew is the reason you had so many siblings was because we needed to be fruitful and fill up our ranks. There was such a heavy emphasis on
And I don't think that's
procreation.
true. I don't think that's
It's
a
not.
lot of people say that it's essentially like, the Hasidic community taking revenge against Hitler, right? How many times have you heard that, right? It's like to make up the numbers. No, it's just Jewish law that, Jewish law as interpreted within ultra-Orthodoxy is that you are not allowed to kind of use birth control, right? Or, you don't decide. The Torah says, um, the Hebrew word is pru, which basically means multiply,
Right.
and you cannot do anything to stop it. That's my understanding. I hear from outsiders being like, "Oh, that's why they have a lot of kids to make up for the loss," but
My
I don't think that.
ignorance is astounding, so please
No,
forgive
no, I
me.
wouldn't call it ignorance. The truth is, I don't know either. We don't talk about sex in yeshiva till till the night before the wedding is when a Hasidic boy meets with a rabbi who literally teaches him how to engage in sex.
Wow.
The person he's going to marry the next day. Sometimes it happens 2 days or 3 days before, but that's it.
Wow.
So I can't it's not like we get any any
Sex
health.
ed.
I was going to say even health education, which can touch upon sex ed. We get none of that. We get none of that. So certainly we don't talk about Jewish law pertaining to it. The interesting thing is that sometimes when you study Talmud, there, as a kid, there are certain topics that come up that are quite I don't know what
Risque.
the word is, risque, salacious. But you know what? That's when the teachers skip it. They skip the part. So then even it's like holy text, just at least let us learn, through that. But no, they would skip it, or anything that's difficult that contains, actual math. They'll skip it because they didn't teach us,
Wow.
proper math. And I stress this because oftentimes our opponents, I didn't talk about so much about my actual work, but our opponents will often tout the yeshiva education, the Jewish studies as, look, it contains math, it contains, I don't know, they want to say it contains science, because, when Noah collected all the animals to squeeze them into the ark, that supposedly that kind of like talks about the taxonomy of animals. The point is, though, that the truth is, when difficult math equations would come up, we would actually skip it because no, we didn't learn math. We didn't,
So
Anyway,
thank you.
I'm rambling.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I interrupted your flow, but I really want to cover. So you wanted to become a mental health professional. You went to college. Pick it up, but I really want to get into your incredible work now.
Okay, of course, and I'm sorry that I
No,
often
I
go
this
off.
is we could talk for hours. This is
Yes.
so interesting.
So yes, I had transferred to CUNY at some point, and I was sitting in school taking Intro to Biology, Bio 101. For most of my class, this was kind of like one of those easy courses that's like you pretty much did most of it in elementary, middle, and high school, but you're going to get credit for it because it builds slightly on it. For me, it was brand new. I was learning what a cell was for the first time, what a molecule, biodiversity, photosynthesis. I'm talking about like the basics. And and it became a bit of a joke because I was a determined kid. I was not going to spend these years and get C's and D's and fail. I was gonna learn. So my professor would say something that I didn't understand. I would raise my hand and be like, "What does this mean?" And I'm not talking about these sciencey words. I'm talking about the words she would use to explain science, right? I can't think of an example, but this happened all the time. So I'd be like, what does this mean? What does this mean? So every time it became a joke where every time she would say a new word that she thought that I may not know, so she would go like, Naftuli, do you know what that means? To preempt me
Sure.
questioning and holding up the class. But that's when it hit me because at that point I was surrounded by average public school graduates. And here I am standing out like a thorn or whatever. Still not, this is after years. I was going to school part-time, evening and weekends. I was already surrounded in a secular environment and I was still struggling. And I'm like, This is a lifelong handicap. Is that okay? Is that legal? So I've started asking questions, started inquiring, and someone connected me to a reporter that had apparently dug into that issue. And I was just astonished to discover that New York State had crystal clear laws in place that say non-public schools must provide an education that is, quote, at least substantially equivalent to public schools. The law goes on to discuss, to list what subjects must be taught. English, math, science, history, New York history, US history, and whatever, health education, physical education, and more. And I'm just like, so this is the law. I saw New York State had guidelines which further articulated it. And I was like, how is this possible? So that's when I first got the bug of beginning to do something about it. I was really terrified because I knew I was essentially going to take on the ultra-Orthodox leadership. And growing up, I knew vaguely that they were powerful, they were connected.
Connected politically.
Oh, very connected politically. And my understanding of, and I had no knowledge of the rest of the Jewish world, by the way, even by that point. So I remember looking up at the state education department's website, and there was a guy with the name Abraham, or I think it was even his last name. And I was like, okay, I can't reach out to this guy because he's Jewish. He's probably part of the, I didn't understand that there's a whole spectrum of the Jewish world that actually would be thrilled to improve the education in this community. Yeah, so it was a lot of fear. Again, more looking over my shoulder, more fear of like how it's going to come back to haunt me. But slowly I built up the confidence, and in 2012, I think I began, scheduling meetings with city officials, state officials. They each kicked the can down to the other. The city said, "What? Our responsibility to enforce it? No, it's the state." And the state is like, "No, it's the city." So that's kind of like how it started. I arranged a meeting with a civil rights attorney. He encouraged me to bring other yeshiva graduates. Like, I don't think he could believe what he was hearing. Even though he had worked with the Hasidic community before, I brought him 20 plus yeshiva graduates. We went around the circle. We each had gone to different yeshivas in New York. And the stories were almost identical, right? So he encouraged me to start the organization, and that's what we did. But here we are, 9 years later, and we're still fighting for the same thing, just for the law to be enforced, for kids to get a basic education. It's just, and again, we mean STEM, English, math, science, social studies, the basics. And that's where we are, more or less.
Wow. So, so how do you tell me a little bit more about your organization and how you let people know in the Hasidic communities that you exist, and what, if anything, can you do to help bright young people like yourself to go down the road that you chose to embark on?
Great. Yeah. So in the beginning, we thought, look, if the law is being violated openly, we'll file a lawsuit, and hopefully it'll spur proper enforcement. And at the time, we didn't even know who, but we knew the law is on our side. We're like, sue who? Sue the yeshivas? Sue our parents? Sue the state? Sue the city? Right? But slowly we kind of did settle on this idea that we probably need to sue the state to enforce the law, maybe together with the city. But what's increasingly difficult is to find people who have standing in a court of law. You need to be someone who can show injury, could show harm. You need to be within the statute of limitations. And really what this brings us down to is a limited pool of parents who currently have kids in the system. And they could say, look, here's the law, here's what my kid is getting. It's not, and compel action. But who in their right mind, based on everything I've described to you before, my fear of going to college, right? Who in their right mind would actually go and file a lawsuit while their kid is attending a yeshiva? This is not like the public school system. You could sue the public school system and send your kid to school the next day. Nobody even knows. It's like, but here, it's like, no, you're suing the heads of these schools. At least that's how they perceive it, even if you're technically suing the state or the city. So there's a lot of fear. So what are we left with? With the few people who've left the community, but for one reason or another, their kid is still in the yeshiva system. Well, what's that reason? That's because their spouse remained religious and has educational decision making. So then even though you're out, you may not have proper standing because you don't have educational decision making. Now it's ridiculous because even a stranger should be able to file a complaint when they see a kid is being neglected in this kind of way. And what I'm describing, I think if it hasn't yet resonated, we're talking about a severe case of educational neglect, right? The harm is lifelong. Yes, right now I have a much more fluent, English, and I have managed to get my BA in psychology. I didn't get a PhD in psychology. But I see it as kind of like settling for social work, master's in social work. It's just because it wasn't what I had aimed for. But the point is, the harm is still there to this day. There's still a struggle. So the point is, it's very difficult to bring legal action. It's not that we're not working on it and finding creative ways to pursue it, but the point is we realize that we need to broaden our activities. There needs to be awareness, both in the public and within the Hasidic community. There needs to be some advocacy, which could include legal action, but also lobbying. And then community organizing is getting enough people within the community to speak out and tell their stories. So those are the three buckets that we've been doing. I encourage everyone viewing this, go check out our website, go check out our Facebook, our Twitter, quite active. I think, we've been able to get a lot of people to speak out, and we've gotten a ton of media coverage. And some of it is, interestingly, some of it is the media coverage kind of like goes on and on and on because, in some ways, because of the heavy-handed attempt to suppress us and to suppress the issue. So I'll give you an example. Just yesterday, this news outlet, The City, it's a relatively new one, just filed a lawsuit against the city, against New York City, for failing to respond and to supply documents to their FOIL request. We didn't have to do that. We just had to keep this issue alive for them to realize, hold on, we filed this FOIL request a year ago, and the city is basically stonewalling us, right?
Right.
So this is it's the kind of thing that when you see how far the mayor, governor, and elected officials will go to ignore this issue, for many people that actually makes them want to go after this more. And I think that's a good thing. You could probably see, your viewers probably are seeing that certain mayoral candidates in New York City, there's a mayoral race, and mayoral candidates are basically pandering to our oppressors, pandering to our abusers, and telling them, we're going to let you keep denying kids an education. I just want your vote.
Right. So to be clear, if the Rebbe tells everybody we're voting for this candidate, everybody votes. So it's a block that's very powerful, which is why the politicians can be so easily swayed and influenced to not do the right thing.
Yeah, I want to just inject that it's a little more nuanced than that.
Okay.
The Rebbe, there are multiple Rebbes. It's not so simple where they say vote and everyone votes, but it does have that effect. It's basically you live in a certain ecosystem. What they're going to do is slowly, they're going to be like, this candidate is a Ohev Yisrael, a lover of Jews, but of course they mean of Hasidic Jews.
Right.
He is going to be good for us and this and this and this. This candidate is a Sunni Yisrael, a hater of Jews. Again, that means hater of Hasidic Jews. And therefore, and then they have an entire media ecosystem, which consists of print, hotlines, and so forth. So you slowly get, and you see the endorsements from coalitions of Hasidic leaders, and that one of them just came out yesterday, again, that a coalition of Hasidic leaders in Borough Park basically endorsed a certain candidate. And this is one of the biggest reasons, because he openly and publicly said he will basically leave the yeshivas to their own devices. which means deny kids an education.
Yeah, and if I can go back to the founding fathers of the United States, they deliberately wanted a separation of religion and politics because they knew that religious groups could have so much power and influence over politics. They wanted to try to create, some separation of that.
I wouldn't know because I wasn't taught history. So I
But
will take your word for it.
But this is a big issue, and in the last few years, a lot of the separation of church and state, explicitly where it's not okay for religious leaders to direct their followers to vote a certain way, was written out by Donald Trump. But I want to come back to two things, if I may. One is, did you ever get married in the community? Or is that not a question you want to do?
I am married now. I have a wife and 2 kids.
Okay. And when we started this interview, you talked about wanting to become a mental health professional because you saw mental health issues in the community. And mostly we've been talking about educational neglect. But what about mental health issues in the community? Is that not another form of important neglect?
Well, mental health, mental illnesses happen everywhere. Educational neglect, not so much, certainly not in first world countries, if you will. But it happens everywhere. It is true that in the Hasidic community, there was a greater stigma than in most other communities, which is why I thought, it needs to be addressed. No reason not to. But a lot has actually changed and improved on that front, I would say. What I find is that the community and its leaders don't necessarily oppose change as long as it doesn't involve systemic change. So mental health is like, yeah, why not? I'm sure they're very supportive of people, having access to mental health as long as it doesn't threaten the system.
And as long as the mental health professional speaks Yiddish, apparently.
Well, yes, they do. They do prioritize Yiddish speakers, but I will say that could be seen a culturally sensitive thing. Look, I disagree with. I don't think that should be the need. During COVID, official health officials, they were scrambling to find Yiddish speakers to be contact tracers. It shouldn't have gotten to that point. These are tens of thousands of people born and raised in New York State, where English instruction is the law.
Right.
Not necessarily because English is the language of our land, no, but English instruction is in fact the law, right? So we shouldn't have to scramble in a health crisis to have Yiddish speakers. I also know some yeshiva leaders, some Hasidic leaders want to get the government to have the DMV booklet in Yiddish too. And again, the only reason you need that is because you allow the educational neglect to happen. So I agree with you, Stephen. We shouldn't have to be in a place where mental health professionals must speak Yiddish in order to be able to treat Hasidic clients. I agree with that. But this is the situation, so you need that. You need people who could speak Yiddish. But again, my point was just that ultra-Orthodox leaders don't oppose, improving, access to mental health. And usually it's funded by the government, so more money from the government, right? But anything like what we're pushing for, which is oversight of this yeshiva system, where tens of thousands of kids are being denied an education, they will fight tooth and nail, and they have. They've used up every resource they had, every dollar. It's astonishing how much money, I mean millions, is being spent to keep kids from getting an education. This is happening in New York State in 2021.
Yeah, that is astounding. I seem to remember a bunch of years ago, and I'm not sure if it was at Yankee Stadium or some stadium, a group of, rabbis saying the internet's evil. Say a little bit about that.
Well, I believe it was in City Field.
Okay.
For most of the people over there, I would say for 99.9% of the attendees, it was their first time attending a baseball stadium. Is it a baseball stadium?
Yeah.
We didn't grow up with sports. There was no TV, right? No radio, really. So, but anyway, yes, they were there to decry and to, talk about the evils of the internet. And what's interesting is, I have to say, ironically, within the ultra-Orthodox community, the internet is a greater threat than outside the ultra-Orthodox community. And here's why. If you grow up Hasidic and then you get access to the internet, yes, chances are the first thing you're going to look for is something improper, right?
I would think you'd be Googling, what's the meaning of this word or that word. No. Okay.
No. So and I interact a lot with, Hasidic people who are kind of like really fresh, like, first time interacting with the outside world, very frightened, looking over their shoulder. And it's like, oftentimes their question is like, can you hook me up with girls? That kind of thing. It's like, so you can imagine when you first have access to the internet, that is also for some of them the first thing they do. It's only because of this unhealthy obsession with both, sex and information, access to information. For many people, I have to tell them this is actually not what the secular world is about, that you are clearly attempting to engage with. That's not really what people are out there doing necessarily. But the point is, yes, they oppose the internet because of the potential harm it does, both in terms of these arranged marriages. A lot of these guys, they, no questions, get married to the person you're matched up with, and suddenly you're seeing how other people look and so forth. But then there's also the other fear of access to knowledge. It won't be like the way you describe it, what is the meaning of life, but it would be questions of like, how the world works and so forth. And then, the internet is like a rabbit hole. One thing leads to the next. And, you're reading for the very first time in your entire life, you're reading a little bit about the theories, around evolution and others,
Yeah. I seem to remember reading the story of someone who left Hasidim, and I think he went to Princeton, or he became a physicist, like some super genius person. Do you know who I'm thinking of? Someone who is like, oh my God, he grew up in this environment, but he learned so much. I'm not remembering.
It's not uncommon. I have friends who, through sheer dedication and a lot of investment from people and groups, have been able to succeed. In some sense, I'm the least successful one with my master's in social work. I have friends who have gone on to pursue and even receive PhDs, and one of them, just became a doctor. It takes a tremendous amount of will and investment. But it shouldn't have to be that way, where so many of us basically drop out or give up or struggle unnecessarily, purely because we were denied a basic education.
Right. So we're coming to the end of our time. How can people help your organization? Go to your website. We'll write a blog. You can give links. You can, tell us what else to add. But how can people listening to this go, as you said, how could this be in 2021 that young people are not being given an education?
Yeah, I want New Yorkers and just people everywhere to be outraged about this, because it is outrageous. And I want this to be their dinner conversations and something they're compelled to share on social media or so on and so forth. Oftentimes we're so obsessed about some kids in a certain third world country not having access to an education. Like, literally, look in your backyard. It's literally happening right here. And oftentimes for the same reason, by religious extremism, right?
Right.
So I want them to that's first and foremost, understand how severe it is, be outraged. And oftentimes you'll figure out how to be helpful, but I will still give some concrete instances. Right now we're asking the state education department to implement a proper enforcement mechanism of that law that I've mentioned. The law has existed since 1894, but they're only now working on some sort of enforcement mechanism. So we would like people to reach out to the Board of Regents. We actually have a page that makes it easy, relatively easy, YAFFED.org/no more delays, as a single word, of course.
Great.
And people can easily send a letter. Ideally, we still want people to write. Take out, on your own email, we could share the email addresses and contact information for the Board of Regents and so forth, the State Education Department, to pass it. We're also pushing for legislation that would basically require any non-public school that applies for government funding. We didn't even get to this, Stephen, but these Hasidic yeshivas that are committing mass educational neglect get millions of dollars in taxpayer money.
Please, you have to cover that, please.
There are all these loopholes, where the money follows the child. It's not for the religious education. It's just the kids, getting books and busing and attendance and immunization record keeping and lunch and voucher, childcare voucher, all these different loopholes. The reality is we've done a study. It's not easy because most of these yeshivas are categorized as houses of worship. So they don't file 990s. They don't disclose their funding. You have to go to the source, and even there, it's obscure. But anyway, we did our work. Find it on yaffed.org/resources. We have some interesting reports and data and stuff. It's amazing. But we found that for some Hasidic yeshivas, 2/3 of their funding comes from taxpayers, not tuition.
Oh, so the public is supporting this crime against children.
This is not like some fancy elite private school where the parents, are the ones footing the bill. No, this is mostly taxpayers.
This is crazy.
Federal, state, and some local funding. Title I comes from federal government. Title III. Right now, with this, with the stimulus bills, these yeshivas reap millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. And some of the criteria is that it prioritizes the low-income students.
Yeah.
Meaning schools that have a large portion of low-income students. Guess who that is? When you don't provide an education, you have more low-income students and you qualify for more funding. This is definitely funded by taxpayers. So we're currently, we just introduced legislation that basically requires a non-public school, as they apply for any state funding, to certify that they meet substantial equivalency, these minimum requirements. If, let's say, they lie, they say they meet it, but then there's an investigation and they're caught to not be meeting it, they would lose their funding and would be barred from receiving funding for another 5 years. Okay?
Good.
They have to rehabilitate themselves.
Good.
This is legislation. We want as much support as possible. So we need co-sponsors in the New York Assembly, the New York Senate, and we need a coalition of organizations and individuals to push for it, right? So that's another way people can help. And again, being active on social media, right now there's a mayoral election. I want your favorite mayoral candidate to know that this is going to be your issue. You're going to be a single issue voter. Okay, are you going to take it seriously? Ensure that the fastest growing denomination, the fastest growing group in New York City and New York State gets an education or not? That's going to be my decisive vote. I think that would be powerful. If they hear it from enough people, they would stop the pandering, because they realize that for every Hasidic vote they get by pandering, they'll lose 2 votes on the other side. So that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I think the pressure on the politicians is the way to go, and the lawsuits.
Any lawyer who's out there willing to do any pro bono work, we're putting together a solid team of pro bono attorneys, and we would definitely appreciate their help.
Wonderful. I'm so grateful for your good work, and you're such a role model to all those who are still stuck in this netherworld where they're cut off from being able to grow and to think from different ways and good work. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So